I think she's handling great. I think she talks a lot of and she gets a lot of back. So she deserves everything she gets because she gives it as good as she gets it. She's just not built for the physicality of this league.
Revenge doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it's quieter, colder, and far more devastating. For decades, women's basketball revolved around one man, Geno Auriemma. His word was gospel, his dynasty unshakable, his authority unquestioned. But when Caitlin Clark stepped into the spotlight, everything began to shift. She didn't challenge him with trash talk or public feuds. She didn't need to. With a single decision, one word, she dismantled an empire that had stood for over 30 years.
The delusional fan base that follows her disrespected the WNBA players by saying she's going to go in that league and tear it apart. There were actually odds on she's third or fourth in betting odds on being MVP of the WNBA. These people are so disrespectful and so unknowledgeable and so stupid that it gives women's basketball a bad name.
Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't shouted from a stage or blasted across headlines. It's delivered in silence. No theatrics, no speeches, just a single decision that flips the balance of power. That's exactly what Caitlin Clark did. One word, whispered so softly you could almost miss it, yet powerful enough to echo through decades of dominance. For Caitlin Clark, that word was simple. No to Geno Auriemma. No to UConn's once untouchable empire. No to $1 million check that came wrapped in strings.
You know, when people talk about in WNBA, why are these people beating up Caitlin Clark? Because she talks a lot of on the court. All right? That's what makes her good.
On the surface, her refusal seemed almost insane. Who turns down over $1 million for just 8 weeks of basketball? 8 weeks of glory, comfort, and prestige. 8 weeks of headlines, TV cameras, and history books. For most players, that offer would have been irresistible, life-changing, career-defining. But Caitlin Clark wasn't most players. She saw the truth hidden beneath the shine. This wasn't just a contract, it was a rescue line, a desperate attempt to pull Geno's name back into relevance by attaching it to hers. To outsiders, it looked like opportunity. To Clark, it looked like manipulation. She knew that signing wouldn't just mean playing basketball, it would mean surrendering her story, letting the same man who once ignored her rewrite her legacy as if it were his to own. And that's why her no landed like a dagger. It wasn't a tantrum, it wasn't a grudge dragged out in the media. It was colder than that, sharper than that. She didn't clap back on social media, she didn't call out his arrogance by name, she simply shut the door in silence, and that silence roared louder than any speech.
She's just not built for the physicality of this league. She's not quick enough to get away from the physicality. End quote. Geno, just say you're a UConn guy and you thought this was going to be Paige and instead it's Caitlin.
That's exactly it.
Because in that one moment, Caitlin Clark didn't just reject Geno's contract, she rejected the idea that he still held the keys to women's basketball. She revealed his desperation, stripped away his aura of invincibility, and showed the world that his empire wasn't eternal. It was fragile. Her revenge wasn't fire. It was ice. It wasn't a scream. It was a whisper. But that whisper shook the walls of a dynasty that had stood untouched for 30 years. To understand the weight of Caitlin Clark's refusal, you have to understand the world she was rejecting. For 3 decades, women's basketball was defined by one man, Geno Auriemma. He wasn't just a coach, he was the architect of an empire. At UConn, he transformed a college program into a dynasty that felt more like myth than reality. 11 national championships. Seasons so dominant that opponents weren't simply defeated, they were erased, reduced to background characters in his story of conquest. For generations of players, UConn wasn't just a school. It was basketball heaven, the golden ticket every recruit dreamed of. Wearing a Huskies jersey wasn't about competing, it was about becoming immortal. Diana Taurasi, Maya Moore, Breanna Stewart, legends who didn't just play the game, they reshaped it, all under Geno's rule. But here's the question. What happens when the gatekeeper of greatness ignores the very player destined to redefine the sport? What happens when the empire that once pulled every star within its orbit suddenly looks the other way? And more importantly, what happens when that star grows strong enough to no longer need the empire at all? This authority made Geno more than a coach. It made him a gatekeeper. For 30 years, the path to greatness in women's basketball ran straight through Storrs, Connecticut. If you wanted to touch history, you needed his approval. His empire wasn't just built on trophies. It was built on the belief that no one could rise without his blessing. But empires only remain invincible until someone dares to ask the question, what if we don't need the king anymore? Caitlin Clark grew up looking at UConn the way a kid stares at the stars, distant, dazzling, and untouchable. To her, the Huskies weren't just a team, they were the dream, the dynasty, the ultimate validation for any girl who picked up a basketball. And for someone with her talent, the call from Geno Auriemma felt inevitable. But that call never came. No visit, no text, no effort, just silence. Why didn't Geno call? How does the self-proclaimed king of women's basketball overlook the most electrifying scorer of her generation? Was it arrogance? Was it tunnel vision? Or was it simply a refusal to believe greatness could exist outside of his control? Instead, Geno chose Paige Bueckers, the nation's #1 recruit at the time. To him, one superstar was enough. Why gamble on overlap when you could already shape the game around your chosen prodigy? But then came the part that stung even more. Geno later claimed that if Caitlin really wanted UConn, she should have picked up the phone herself. Think about that. The same man who prided himself on spotting generational talent before anyone else didn't recognize Caitlin Clark, the player who would soon redefine the sport. Instead of accountability, he placed the burden on a teenager. Instead of humility, he showed arrogance. And here's the bigger question. How many dynasties collapse because the ruler doesn't even see the threat coming? When Caitlin Clark chose Iowa, the basketball world raised its eyebrows. UConn was the empire, the cathedral of women's basketball. 11 national championships, walls draped with banners, rosters stacked with legends. Iowa? Iowa had none of that. No dynasty, no national dominance, no aura of inevitability. To most, it looked like she had chosen smallness over greatness. Like she had walked away from the throne room of immortality to play in a forgotten corner of the map. But here's the truth. Sometimes the smallest stage gives you the biggest spotlight. At Iowa, Clark wasn't anyone's backup plan. She wasn't Paige Bueckers' understudy, waiting for her turn in Geno's script. She wasn't just another star swallowed up by UConn's machine. In Iowa City, she was the story. From the first moment she put on that jersey, she wasn't another piece of history. She was history in the making. And with that freedom, she didn't just play basketball, she transformed it. Her logo threes weren't just buckets, they were announcements. I don't need UConn to be great. Her passes weren't just assists, they were artistry, viral moments that ricocheted across social media, pulling in fans who had never cared about women's basketball before. Every time she stepped on the court, it wasn't just a game, it was an event. Arenas that once struggled to sell tickets were suddenly overflowing. Families were driving across states just to watch her warm up. Kids camped outside arenas, holding homemade signs, hoping for a glimpse. And here's the twist. Every time Clark elevated Iowa, she exposed UConn. If one player could drag a so-called irrelevant program into the national spotlight, what did that say about the empire Geno had built? Was UConn's dominance really about genius, or was it about gatekeeping talent like hers? The contrast couldn't be ignored. UConn had the banners, but Caitlin Clark had something far more powerful: cultural gravity. She wasn't just winning games, she was dragging an entire sport into mainstream conversations. Suddenly, women's basketball wasn't tucked away in niche coverage. It was standing shoulder to shoulder with the NFL, NBA, and MLB on the nightly highlight reels. So, was Iowa a consolation prize? Or was it destiny? Would Clark have ever become a global icon at UConn, where her light would have been shared with others? Or did Geno's silence give her the greatest gift of all, the chance to build her own empire from scratch on her own terms? By the time her deep threes were breaking records and her games were breaking television ratings, the answer was undeniable. UCNN had the dynasty. Caitlin Clark had the future. But if Geno Auriemma's silence during Clark's recruitment stung, what came next cut even deeper. Instead of acknowledging her rise, instead of giving her the respect she had undeniably earned, he chose mockery. When asked about Caitlin Clark, Geno brushed her off with a smirk. He compared her game to a kid pretending in the driveway. Pretending. As if the player who was dragging women's basketball into the national spotlight was nothing more than a child fooling around with a ball. But the disrespect didn't stop with Clark herself. It spilled over onto her fans. He called them naive. He said they didn't understand the game. He accused them of being a liability to women's basketball, of giving the sport a bad name by believing in her too much. Think about that for a second. Parents driving hours just so their daughters could watch Caitlin warm up. Young girls lining up for selfies, clutching posters, dreaming of being the next Caitlin Clark. New fans tuning into women's basketball for the very first time, filling arenas, spiking TV ratings, buying jerseys, keeping the sport alive. And what did Geno see? Not a blessing, but a burden. Not growth, but ignorance. Why would a coach, someone who built his empire on the backs of star players, turn his nose up at the wave of new energy flooding the game? Was it arrogance? Was it fear? Or was it the realization that for the first time, the spotlight wasn't revolving around him? Because here's the irony. Those delusional fans Geno mocked weren't just lifting Clark. They were lifting the entire sport. They were the reason ticket sales skyrocketed. They were the reason women's basketball was trending in spaces it had never reached before. They weren't a problem. They were the future. And by ridiculing them, Geno made the most dangerous mistake any king can make. He insulted his own people. That was the crack in the armor. The moment the once untouchable authority revealed his weakness. Because if you're truly secure in your empire, you don't lash out at the fans breathing new life into your sport. You welcome them, you nurture them, you thank them. Geno didn't. He mocked them. And in doing so, he turned his back not just on Caitlin Clark, but on the very future of basketball itself. The critics said her fans were delusional. Geno called them naive, too blinded by hype to understand the game. The betting odds that placed Caitlin Clark in MVP conversations? He laughed them off as a joke. To him, the idea that a rookie could dominate the WNBA was childish fantasy. But then reality hit, and it hit hard. Caitlin Clark's rookie season wasn't just good, it was revolutionary. She didn't just survive in the league, she thrived. Rookie of the Year, first team All-WNBA. And exactly as those so-called naive fans predicted, she finished fourth in MVP voting. Fourth. Not in some distant future, not years down the line, her very first year. What Geno dismissed as blind fanaticism became undeniable fact. Every stat line, every highlight, every record broken was proof that Caitlin Clark wasn't a product of hype. She was the hype. And the fans who believed in her? They weren't delusional at all. They were visionaries. Think about what that meant. The parents who drove for hours, the kids camping outside arenas, the millions tuning into women's basketball for the first time, they were right. Clark wasn't just carrying her career on her back. She was carrying theirs. She was validating their belief that women's basketball could stand shoulder to shoulder with the biggest sports in the world. And in the process, she did something Geno never intended. She embarrassed him. The same man who mocked her rise, who ridiculed her supporters, who dismissed her as ordinary, had to watch as she dragged women's basketball into mainstream conversations where even he couldn't control the narrative. This was the dagger. Caitlin Clark didn't just prove herself, she proved everyone else wrong. And she did it not with words, but with results. By now, Caitlin Clark had done the unthinkable. She had proven that women's basketball no longer needed Geno Auriemma's approval to thrive. But instead of accepting that reality, Geno tried one last move. He turned to Unrivaled, a shiny new 3-on-3 women's league meant to disrupt the system. On paper, it had everything. Star names like Breanna Stewart and Nafisa Collier, serious funding, and ambition to spare. But there was one glaring problem. It didn't have a face. No singular star who could draw millions of fans. No gravitational pull. No cultural magnet. And in today's game, there was only one athlete who could do that: Caitlin Clark. So Geno swallowed his pride. The same coach who ignored her as a teenager, who mocked her rise, who ridiculed her fans, suddenly he needed her. He wasn't just offering respect, he was offering a check. Over $1 million for just 8 weeks of play. At first glance, it seemed impossible to refuse. 8 weeks, 7 figures, a chance to anchor a brand new league. Who would say no? But Clark saw what most didn't. This wasn't just money, this was a trap. Signing that deal wouldn't just mean joining a new league. It would mean letting Geno reclaim control of her story, stitching her rise back into his legacy as if it had always been part of his brilliance. He wanted her shine not to build something new, but to save his fading relevance. And that's why Caitlin Clark's answer was so devastating. She didn't hesitate. She didn't negotiate. She didn't explain. She just said no. No to the money. No to the manipulation. No to being folded back into Geno's narrative. In that moment, Geno's desperation wasn't just visible, it was undeniable. The king who once dictated women's basketball had been reduced to begging for the approval of the very player he had once dismissed. Caitlin Clark's no wasn't just a business decision. It was a turning point. For decades, Geno Auriemma was the gatekeeper of women's basketball. If you wanted to matter, you went through him. But with one word, Clark dismantled that illusion. She didn't just refuse a paycheck, she refused his power. She proved that greatness no longer needed Geno's approval. In that moment, the myth of his invincibility collapsed. The balance of power had shifted. For the first time, the future of women's basketball didn't belong to dynasties or coaches. It belonged to the players bold enough to write their own story. Clark didn't roar, she didn't fight, she whispered no, and it echoed louder than 11 championships. So the question now is this: if Caitlin Clark can topple the sport's most powerful dynasty with a single decision, what else is she about to change?